When you close your eyes and think of New York, you almost certainly see the concrete canyon. You see the flashing billboards of Times Square, the trading floor of Wall Street, and the relentless vertical sprawl of the modern metropolis. You see the noise, but to understand the actual history of this place, you have to strip all of that away. You have to mentally bulldoze the skyscrapers, uproot the pavement, and silence the subways until you are left with nothing but a deep, wide river and a dense, ancient forest. Before this was the financial capital of the world. It was a strategic wilderness. Before it was the Big Apple, it was a battlefield where empires collided. And before it was a state, it was the home of a political sophistication that rivaled anything in Europe. The story of New York is not just the story of a city growing up. It is the story of geography, war, and the single most important waterway in North American history. This state has always been the hinge of American history. Because of where it sits on the map, it acted as the gateway for millions of immigrants, the laboratory for the Industrial Revolution, and the crucial pivot point for the War of Independence. But long before the first brick was laid on Manhattan, the destiny of this region was written by the Ice Age. When the glaciers receded, they carved out the Hudson River, not just a river, but a tidal fjord, deep enough for ocean-going ships to sail 150 miles into the interior. Whoever held this river held the keys to the continent, and the first people to hold those keys weren't the Dutch or the English, they were the Haudenosaunee. This wasn't just a loose collection of tribes, it was a highly organized political alliance of 5 distinct nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. They lived in permanent fortified towns and operated under the Great Law of Peace, a constitution that established a democratic system of checks and balances long before the United States existed. While the Algonquian peoples inhabited the coastal islands and the lower Hudson Valley, the Iroquois controlled the fur trade in the interior, making them a force that no European power could ignore. But the collision course began in 1609. An English explorer named Henry Hudson was sailing for the Dutch East India Company. He wasn't interested in New York. He was desperately trying to find the Northwest Passage's shortcut to the spice markets of Asia. He didn't find the path to China, but when he sailed his ship, the Half Moon, into the New York harbor, he realized he had found something else: the finest natural harbor on the Atlantic coast. The Dutch, being the shrewd business people of the 17th century, didn't waste any time. They didn't come here for religious freedom like the Pilgrims in Massachusetts. They came here to make money. They established the colony of New Netherland. They built a trading post up the river called Fort Orange today, Albany, and a capital city on the southern tip of Manhattan Island called New Amsterdam. Because the colony was run by a corporation, the Dutch West India Company was obsessed with efficiency and trade. This created a unique DNA for the region right from the start. While Boston was worrying about Bibles, New York was worrying about ledgers. It became a melting pot almost immediately, with reports from the 1640s stating that 18 different languages were already spoken on the streets of Manhattan. However, the Dutch rule was short-lived. The British Empire looked at the map and saw that the Dutch colony was a wedge separating their New England colonies from their southern colonies. In 1664, 4 British frigates arrived in the harbor with their cannons run out. The Dutch Director General, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to fight to the death, but the merchants of the city refused. They surrendered without a single shot fired, and just like that, New Netherland became New York, named after the king's brother, the Duke of York, and the stage was set for the rise of the Empire State. To understand the history of New York, you must first understand the ice. 10,000 years ago, massive glaciers retreated north, carving out deep U-shaped valleys and leaving behind a landscape defined by water. They created the Hudson River, a tidal estuary deep enough to carry ships far inland, the Great Lakes to the west. This unique geography created a natural corridor through the Appalachian Mountains, a feature that would one day dictate the destiny of the entire continent. But long before this land appeared on any European map, it was the domain of the Haudenosaunee. By the 12th century, the region was a battleground of warring tribes. Peace only came through the formation of the Haudenosaunee, known to the French as the Iroquois Confederacy. Composed of 5 distinct nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, they occupied a vast territory stretching from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. They were not merely a loose alliance. They were a sophisticated political union bound by the Great Law of Peace. This system was centuries ahead of its time. It utilized a representative council, checks and balances, and a separation of powers. Clan mothers held the power to appoint and remove chiefs, ensuring a balance between genders that Europe wouldn't see for another 500 years. They controlled the fur trade routes and acted as the gatekeepers of the interior. When Europeans eventually arrived, they didn't find savages in the wilderness. They found a political superpower that commanded the landscape with military might and diplomatic genius. In September 1609, the silence of the Hudson Valley was broken by the creak of English oak and Dutch canvas. Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, navigated the river that now bears his name. He was hunting for a route to China. Instead, he found beaver pelts. For the Dutch, who were the world's leading capitalists at the time, this was good enough. They weren't interested in converting souls or escaping persecution. They were interested in profit. They established the colony of New Netherland. It was a business venture from day one. They built Fort Orange in the north to tap into the fur trade with the Iroquois, and they built a port city at the mouth of the river, New Amsterdam. Under the Dutch West India Company, the colony developed a unique character. It was rowdy, diverse, and surprisingly tolerant, not out of morality, but because intolerance was bad for business. By the 1640s, you could hear 18 different languages spoken on the streets of Manhattan. But the colony had a fatal flaw. It was run by a corporation, not a government, so the people had little loyalty to it. When the British fleet arrived in 1664 to seize the strategic harbor, the Director General Peter Stuyvesant tried to rally the citizens to fight. They refused. They essentially said, "If we can keep our property and our trade rights, we don't care which flag flies over the fort." The Dutch surrendered without firing a shot. New Amsterdam was renamed New York after the Duke of York. The Dutch were gone politically, but their DNA, the focus on commerce, diversity, and social mobility, remained the bedrock of the city. Under British rule, New York flourished as a critical Atlantic port, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. The colony became a place of extreme stratification. While New England was filled with small family farms, huge swaths of the Hudson Valley were owned by and lords who lived like European aristocracy, renting land to tenant farmers. This disparity created a rebellious underclass. Simultaneously, New York City was becoming a hotbed of radical ideas, specifically regarding the freedom of the press. In 1735, a printer named John Peter Zenger was thrown in jail for criticizing the royal governor. In a landmark trial, his lawyer argued something revolutionary, that the truth could not be libel. The jury acquitted Zenger, setting a legal precedent for freedom of the press that would eventually be enshrined in the First Amendment. This spirit of defiance grew as the British Crown imposed taxes like the Stamp Act. New York was a complicated place on the eve of the Revolution. It was the headquarters of the British Army in America, making it a stronghold for loyalists who supported the king. But it was also the home of the Sons of Liberty, aggressive agitators who brawled with soldiers in the streets. When the Declaration of Independence was read in July 1776 at City Hall Park, a rowdy mob marched down Broadway and tore down the gilded statue of King George III, melting the lead to make 42,000 musket balls. The war had arrived, and New York was the prize. If you look at a map of the 13 colonies, New York is the keystone. The British strategy was simple: capture New York City, control the Hudson River, and split the rebellious New England colonies from the rest of the continent. In 1776, they almost succeeded. The largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War took place in Brooklyn, the Battle of Long Island. George Washington was outmaneuvered and crushed. He only survived by executing a miraculous night evacuation across the river under the cover of fog. For the next 7 years, NYC was occupied territory. It was a bleak time. Thousands of American prisoners of war died in horrific conditions on British prison ships anchored in Wallabout Bay. But while the city fell, the state held. In 1777, a massive British army under General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada, aiming to secure the Hudson. They were met by American forces in the wilderness near Saratoga. The battles of Saratoga changed world history. The Americans didn't just hold the line, they captured an entire British army. This victory sent a shockwave across the Atlantic, convincing King Louis XVI of France that the American rebels were capable of winning. France entered the war as an ally, providing the money and navy needed to secure independence. The war technically ended at Yorktown, but it was won in the forests of New York. When the British finally evacuated NYC in 1783, Washington rode triumphantly down Broadway, reclaiming the city that would briefly serve as the nation's first capital. The war was over, but the United States was economically broken and geographically fractured. The Appalachian Mountains stood as a formidable wall, blocking trade between the Atlantic coast and the fertile interior. Enter DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, who championed a project so ambitious many thought he was insane. A 363-mile canal connecting the Hudson River to Lake Erie. Critics called it Clinton's Ditch or Clinton's Folly. They said it was an impossible engineering task for a young nation. Construction began in 1817. Thousands of laborers, many of them Irish immigrants, dug through swamps and blasted through limestone by hand. When the Erie Canal opened in 1825, it triggered an economic explosion. Before the canal, transporting a ton of wheat from Buffalo to New York City cost $100 and took 3 weeks. After the canal, it cost $10 and took less than a week. The canal didn't just make New York rich, it made it the Empire State. The harbor of New York City became the funnel for the entire continent's goods. Western raw materials flowed east, and European manufactured goods flowed west. Upstate villages transformed into booming industrial cities overnight. Rochester became the world's leading flour producer, and Buffalo became a steel giant. This infrastructure project solidified New York's dominance, eclipsing rivals like Philadelphia and Boston forever. As the 19th century progressed, New York found itself in a dangerous moral contradiction. The state had abolished slavery by 1827, and it was a critical hub for the Underground Railroad, with leaders like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman operating out of Rochester and Auburn. Yet, New York City's economy was inextricably tied to the South. The city's bankers financed the southern plantations, and its merchants shipped the cotton. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the mayor of New York actually suggested the city should secede from the Union to protect its trade. The tension snapped in 1863. The federal government instituted a military draft, but wealthy men could pay $300 to avoid service fee the working poor could never afford. This class resentment, combined with racial animosity, ignited the New York City draft riots. For 4 days, the city descended into anarchy. Mobs destroyed telegraph lines, burned down the colored orphan asylum, and lynched black citizens in the streets. It remains the deadliest civil unrest in American history. The Union Army had to be diverted from the battlefield at Gettysburg to retake the city of New York from the rioters. Despite this dark chapter, New York State eventually contributed more money, soldiers, and supplies to the Union cause than any other state. The war solidified the industrial power of the North, and New York emerged from the bloodshed wealthier and more powerful than ever before. Following the Civil War, New York entered the Gilded Age, an era of unprecedented wealth and stark inequality. This was the age of the robber barons. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan controlled the nation's railroads and finances from their offices in Lower Manhattan. They built palaces on Fifth Avenue and cottages in Newport, living like royalty. But just a few miles away, on the Lower East Side, a different reality existed. Jacob Riis, a muckraking journalist, published How the Other Half Lives, exposing the squalor of tenement life, where millions of new immigrants struggled to survive. And still, they came. In 1892, the federal government opened Ellis Island in the shadow of the newly dedicated Statue of Liberty. It was the gateway to the American dream. Over the next few decades, 12 million people would pass through Ellis Island. They came from Italy, Poland, Russia, Ireland, and beyond, fleeing poverty and persecution. They provided the labor that built the modern city, the subway tunnels, the bridges, and the skyscrapers. This massive influx of humanity created the cosmopolitan, polyglot energy that defines New York today. By 1900, New York wasn't just an American city, it was the capital of the world. The 1920s brought a cultural explosion that permanently altered the American identity. In northern Manhattan, the Harlem Renaissance bloomed. It was a golden age of African American art, literature, and music. Visionaries like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington challenged racial stereotypes and created a sophisticated new culture that captivated the world. Meanwhile, Midtown was reaching for the sky. The race to the sky saw the construction of Art Deco masterpieces like the Chrysler Building. But the party ended in 1929. The stock market crashed, plunging the city and state into the Great Depression. Yet, even in the depths of economic despair, New York continued to build. The Empire State Building was completed in 1931, rising as a symbol of hope when morale was at its lowest. Leadership mattered. Maggio Fiore LaGuardia, the Little Flower, secured massive amounts of New Deal funding from Washington. He put New Yorkers to work building highways, housing projects, and airports. When World War II arrived, New York State served as the arsenal of democracy, with factories in Buffalo and Long Island churning out airplanes and munitions, while the Brooklyn Navy Yard repaired the battleships that would liberate Europe. As the master builder, he held unelected power for decades. His vision was modern, brutal, and car-centric. He built the Triborough Bridge, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, Jones Beach, and a web of parkways that strangled the city in concrete. To achieve this, he displaced hundreds of thousands of residents, bulldozing vibrant neighborhoods like the South Bronx to make way for Moses's roads facilitated a mass exodus. The GI Bill and the rise of the automobile allowed the middle class to flee the city for the newly created suburbs. Like Levittown on Long Island, this white flight drained the city's tax base and population, setting the stage for urban decline. But culturally, the state remained the epicenter of cool. In 1969, New York was the heartbeat of the counterculture. In June, the Stonewall Uprising in Greenwich Village sparked the modern LGBTQ rights movement. 2 months later, nearly 500,000 people gathered at Maxie Asker's farm in Bethel, NY, for Woodstock. It was a moment of peace and music that defined a generation, proving that despite the shifting demographics, the cultural gravity of New York was undeniable. The 1970s were the dark ages. The city went bankrupt, crime spiked, and the South Bronx was burning. The federal government initially refused to bail the city out. But New York is nothing if not resilient. Through the 80s and 90s, the financial sector rebounded, and crime rates began a historic drop. The city cleaned up, perhaps losing some of its edge, but gaining stability. Then came the morning of September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center were intended to break the American spirit by striking its financial heart. It did the opposite. The heroism of the NYPD, the FDNY, and ordinary citizens united the state and the nation. The rebuilding of the site and the construction of the One World Trade Center served as a physical testament to the refusal to surrender. Today, New York faces new challenges: climate change, cost of living, and a changing economy. But the fundamentals that made it the Empire State remain. It is still the gateway, the melting pot, and the stage where the biggest dreams are played out. From the ancient councils of the Haudenosaunee to the trading floors of Wall Street, the story of New York is the story of ambition. And that story is far from over. When you look back at the sweep of these 4 centuries, a single truth emerges. New York has never been content to just exist. It has always insisted on leading. From the moment the glaciers receded, this land was destined to be a corridor of movement and a cradle of power. It is where the great law of peace taught the world that diverse nations could unite under one roof. It is where the Dutch taught the continent that commerce could be the strongest bond of all. It is where a young nation, broke and fractured, decided to dig a ditch to the sea and accidentally invented the modern global economy. Whether it was the immigrants stepping off the boat at Ellis Island with nothing but their names, or the ironworkers walking the beams of the skyline with nothing but their nerve, the story of this state is the story of people who refused to accept the world as it was and instead decided to build the world as they imagined it could be. The historian Kenneth T. Jackson once said that New York is not just a place, but a proposition. It is the proposition that you can bring people together from every corner of the earth, pile them on top of each other on a rocky island, and somehow produce the greatest engine of culture and capital the world has ever seen. The Empire State isn't just a nickname on a license plate. It is a description of the sheer, relentless ambition that runs through the bedrock of this place. We've covered 10,000 years of history today, but in a state that moves this fast, history is being written every single second. Thank you for taking this journey through the Empire State with me. This was a massive undertaking, and there are thousands of stories we had to leave on the cutting room floor, from the political machine of Tammany Hall to the invention of the potato chip in Saratoga. If you want to see a deep dive into any specific era we touched on today, Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this documentary, please hit that like button and subscribe. It truly helps the channel keep making these deep dives. I'm US State History, and I'll see you in the next one.